Okay, my friends, let's do this. My name is David Parsons, and you are listening to Nostalgia Trap. I thank you for doing so. I welcome you to the program. I am quite excited to share this interview with you today, and we'll get to it in a second. But first, I just want to note that this is officially episode 400 of Nostalgia Trap. And I think actually when you include all the News Trap episodes, all the bonus stuff on Patreon, we probably have done more like 500 Nostalgia Trap universe episodes, which is intense, honestly, to think about. I never thought I'd put that much stuff out. But I really appreciate everyone who listens to the show, everyone who supports the show on Patreon. I wouldn't be doing it if there weren't people who were doing that and showing a little love to Nostalgia Trap and all the people who have been on the show, all the guests. I want to shout out especially to Justin Rogers Cooper, who has been a steady partner in all of this and honestly an inspiration for so many of the thoughts and ideas we share on the show. So thank you, Justin. Shout out to you. I know you're a humble and modest guy that doesn't like to be complimented, but you've been especially critical to the show's success. So thank you, and thank you everyone who likes Nostalgia Trap and shares our stuff. It's been a fun journey, and I continue to be amazed that anyone even listens at all. So thank you, and we're going to share a little more of my own obsession here today. I've been thinking a lot about Walt Disney as a creator, as a capitalist, as a key figure in the history of American popular culture. He's just someone who has a lot going on, and I've been reading this massive biography by Neil Gabler. I'll share all these links to these books in the episode description. But Gabler's biography is really intense, and I think I would recommend it if you're looking for like a big, sweeping and detailed vision of Walt Disney's life and what it's really meant. But there was a key part of that biography that kind of, I don't know, lit up my imagination, and that was the story of the animators' strike that happened in 1941. I did a little Nostalgia Trap episode on Patreon about that strike specifically, so if you're a subscriber, you can go back and find that video, I think, and episode on our Patreon page. Maybe I'll put the link to that as well in the episode description. But I was wondering if there was a whole book about the animator strike, and indeed there is, and I'm talking with the author of that book today. His name is Jake S. Friedman. The book is called The Disney Revolt, The Great Labor War of Animation's Golden Age, and it is full of incredible detail of what happened when Disney's family of animators went on strike during World War II, and honestly shocked Walt Disney himself and shocked the Disney Corporation, and nothing was ever the same there. This book is incredible, and it has some great, more than some, it has a ton of great images because this strike was a really visually striking, didn't mean to do the pun there, but visually compelling strike in the way that the animators sort of used their artistic skills to render their anger at the Walt Disney Corporation and at Disney himself. So this was a super fun conversation. I really appreciated getting to know Jake in this conversation. And I especially enjoyed a moment at the end of this episode. I kind of put him on the spot and asked him why he is into animation, because as you'll learn, this author is someone who is an animator himself and is sort of obsessed with not only the history of animation, but the art of animation. And I wanted to just ask him, why do you like animation? And it ended up making a great connection to maybe why I'm obsessed with Disney. So that was a really, really compelling moment in this interview. The whole thing is really fun. I hope you enjoy it. And again, thank you so much for being a Nostalgia Trap listener, and enjoy this interview with Jake S. Friedman. Jake S. Friedman, you wrote a book called The Disney Revolt, The Great Labor War of Animation's Golden Age. I read it over the course of the last week. Really enjoyed it. So thank you for joining me. You've got a copy as well. I imagine that you might have a copy of it.
I can't not. Although mine isn't signed. Is it weird for an author to sign his own copy? I can't bring myself to sign my own copy.
No, I just say I've signed every one of my own books and just I say I love you and then put my name on there. And then you asked earlier before we got started how I found your book. Well, I mean, I've been thinking about the Disney animator strike for a while since I discovered it. I think this book, Walt
Ah,
Disney
yeah.
by
Neil
Neil
Gaiman.
Gabler,
Yeah.
the Triumph of the American Imagination. I found this. I'm a fan of big biographies,
Mhm.
and I found this in a record store, a used copy for like $8, and I said, you know what, I could use a brush up on Disney history. Just because I'm from Southern California, I grew up going to Disneyland. Disney's been a big part of my life, one way or the other. But I didn't know that there was an animator strike in 1941, and that the history of the Disney company intersects with the larger history of American labor in a very interesting way. And I thought to myself, I wonder if anyone's written a book about this. And so, I Googled it and I found The Disney Revolt by Jake S. Friedman. And now here you are. So that's the story.
Thank you. And I guess thank you to Neil Gabler for writing such a definitive book about Walt Disney's overall life and career.
It's really good, actually. I mean, both books are super involving. I think that especially the labor strike stuff. I don't think many people know about it. Was that your experience in writing this?
I've it came down to two things, like 50-50. Half the people didn't even know it existed, and
Hmm.
half the people knew something about it, but not really how it came to be. And people were pointing fingers. Oh, the strike leader was bad. Oh, Walt was bad. And I mean, I know human beings enough to know that we're more nuanced than saying we're good or we're bad. And I wanted to tell that story, because I admire Walt Disney and I admire strike leaders and
Hmm.
members of unions. So my heart is in both camps, and I wanted to tell a story without there being a bad guy, with the exception of the evil vice president who was like kind of like the Jafar of the story.
Is that
Um,
Gunther Lessing?
yeah, that's Gunther Lessing. Yeah,
Yeah.
he
He's the
kind of
guy that I mean, it first caught my attention was actually the visual element of this strike, like seeing photographs of it online. And there are a lot of them in your book. And your book actually, what I love about it is it shares a lot of the drawings that these artists were sharing while they were on strike. But yeah, they were like, this strike was very, for those that don't know, just to get us started on what this is. This strike happened in 1941. It was animators who were upset with not just like wages, but also working conditions and the hierarchies that existed at Disney. But the strike itself it's really visually intense because these were all Disney artists. And so you end up having like all these great, beautiful picket signs with cartoons all over them. And at one point they have like an effigy and they are like dressed like medieval executioners with a guillotine of Gunther Lessing, and that just all of it just sparked my imagination of like what was going on in this scene.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed out all those drawings. I'm going to tell you something that I haven't told any other podcast interviews. That I was walking. I live in Manhattan, and I was walking down the corner, and I see Al Franken, and I say, Al Franken, I've loved your books, Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them, things like that. And I say, I'm writing a book. He says, You're writing a book? I said, Yes. It's about the labor strike at Disney in 1941. He said, Well, I hope there are a lot of drawings in it. And I went, because at that time, I didn't think I would put in a lot of drawings. Photos, yes. But that piece of feedback from Al Franken
Of all
really,
people, yeah.
well, people really stuck with me. And I thought, I'm going to go out of my way to get as many like internal cartoons and caricatures of the strike as I can, because that's how they express themselves. And these aren't auto workers or garment workers, these are animators going on strike and artists. So that was a great piece of feedback. And I had to argue with my editor over at Chicago Review Press, the publisher of the book, to put more artwork in the book, because artwork takes pages and pages cost money when you print
Yep.
them.
Yep.
really had to dig my heels in, but he relented and let me put in more images and more artwork in the book.
That is such a New York story to like run into a celebrity and just strike up a conversation about your book with them. As long as we're like name dropping, it makes me think of like I just remembered walking downtown in Manhattan near Union Square and seeing Steve Earle, who's like a country singer, like folk singer. And he was
Okay.
a character in the book I was writing about GI coffee houses in the 1960s. So I said the exact same thing. I was like, "Hey, Steve Earle, I'm writing a book and you're in it. And, do you have any story?" And we ended up walking for several blocks. And he told me stories that like made their way into the book, one way or the other. I was like, only in New York.
Oh, that's so great. That's so
Yeah.
great. I hope you were able to send him a copy through his people.
Yeah. I don't know if he ever got it.
Oh,
I did write I love you in it though. Of
as you
course.
should.
Yeah. So yeah, how did you get started thinking about Disney? I know that animation is a part of your life, and maybe you
Mhm.
can tell us a little bit about who you are, Jake
Who,
S. Friedman. But how did you wind up writing this book?
well, who is I? He asks.
Yes.
Um, okay, well, I don't know if anyone listening in Radioland has experienced this when they were kids, but like I knew from a very early age that I wanted to be an animator. As a little kid seeing The Little Mermaid up on the screen, I was like, I want to make things like this.
Mhm.
So I would draw and draw and draw, went to NYU Film School to study animation. And I just, never let go of this dream. And I tied my identity into the profession, which is what a lot of creative people do, I think. They tie their sense of self in with a vocation. So I did that. I was like, I am an animator inside and out. So I loved not just making animation, and I created a student film for my senior thesis that got some award attention, and that landed me my first gig. But I also got really friendly with the instructor of the history of animation named John Culhane. And John Culhane, you might remember, wrote some great books on the history of animation, like Aladdin, The Making of an Animated Film, which is a book that I had owned since I was 13. So I admired the man very much. And he was just such a joy. He was like a big kid. He was like a 65-year-old, like kid looking at things with fresh eyes all the time, childlike wonder. And so I kept on kind of like attending his class, and I was a TA for his class, then a TA again. So I kind of really got really close with him. So when I came back to be a guest speaker to his animation students after I'd started working in the field, he announced to the class that I would be writing the book about the Disney strike. And I was like, what? 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 And that's kind of who John was. Like, if you watch the Fantasia 2000 sequence, Rhapsody in Blue, he is caricatured by animator Eric Goldberg as the man who's flying in the clouds. Like his head's
Wow.
in the clouds. Flying John. So he was kind of like not of this, like he didn't have his feet on the ground. He was just kind of living in a fantasy, a beautiful, glorious, love-filled, joyful fantasy land. Um, and so he told me that the widow of the strike leader, whose name is Art Babbitt, she wanted this book written because she didn't want his story to be forgotten. And she was already at the time, I think, in her 80s. So it took me a long time to warm up to the idea of taking on such a monumental task. And once I did take it on, I flew to, Southern California. She lived in the Hollywood area, and every like once a year, I would just fly there and spend a week or two with her and go through her records. And she had everything that Art Babbitt had saved. Now, Art Babbitt was like a huge Disney animator who like basically created Goofy. He was a lead on Snow White. He animated The Wicked Queen. He animated Geppetto on Pinocchio. He was like a supervising animator during the golden age of Disney animation. So, how weird it is that someone who's so close with Walt's concept of success and artistry, like they're in sync. They want to advance the art of animation. How someone like that could just threaten to tear it all down. Like,
Mm.
what
Yeah.
happened? It wasn't just a snap of the fingers. Like, it was a series of unfortunate events that led up to it. And I found myself kind of identifying with Art Babbitt. Like, he had an internal sense of justice, and for good or for ill, so do I. He was an artist. I am to a degree. He was an educator. I am to a degree. And I kind of saw myself in his shoes, and I kind of felt his presence as I was digging through his stuff. And I don't think I would have worked on this project for as long as I did, which was like 10 years, if it was just for my own self-satisfaction. I really did it for him
Mm.
so that he would have his legacy there. And instead of being blamed by the people who are fans of Walt, or being or blaming Walt for the people who are fans of him, I just wanted to tell a human story about these two human beings who had their own reasons for doing things, and how they started out as extremely close collaborators and finally came to blows in a way that almost destroyed the studio.
Yeah, the in many ways, the strike seems like it boils down to Art Babbitt versus Walt Disney.
Yeah,
And you open the book with the story of Art Babbitt outside the studio gates leading the strike, pointing at Walt Disney and saying, "You should be ashamed, Walt Disney," as Disney comes in his car. And Walt gets out of the car and they almost come to blows. And it's sort of like this really dramatic personal moment between these two guys. But maybe we can go backwards a little bit because you mentioned Snow White and Pinocchio. What was going on at the Disney Corporation in 1941? Because it's sort of the early part of Walt Disney's career. I mean, he really is sort of like the Horatio Alger kind of story of like coming from nothing and using all of his talents to like create something extraordinary.
yeah,
And by the time you get to 1937, 38, I think it is when Snow White comes out and becomes one of the highest grossing films of all time, I didn't really know all of that
the most,
history. Yeah,
the most.
the most, right?
Yeah,
I mean, one thing that I would share that I wanted my listeners to hear that I thought was just an extraordinary moment for I don't know, reflecting Walt Disney's genius was when they're making Snow White and they're thinking about how to like Walt wanted more than anything to make people cry while they watched the movie. He wanted to basically prove that animation could touch people's hearts and
yeah,
make a human connection in a way that other live action films would. And the little moment that I thought was so genius was he thought, well, there'll be a moment in the film when Snow White is sort of like laying dead essentially in the forest and the dwarves are all gathered around her and they're all like kind of welling up with tears. They're getting a little sad about seeing her that way. And he said, what will be key to making people cry here is making the dwarf that's like has a mean stoic face all the time, making him be the one that ultimately breaks out in sobs. And they did that. And it was like a psychological trick in a way. And then to watch it work, like, is just so incredible that, like, when the movie came out, audiences were sobbing alongside the dwarves, and especially when Grumpy sobbed seeing Snow White. And I thought that to me captured how the success of Disney's experiment and the kind of genius behind it. To see it in just a couple years kind of fall apart with these animators is kind of heartbreaking, honestly. Even though the larger context is, yeah, this is just money and work and labor and all that sort of thing. There's something. It felt like Disney had a special kind of connection to animation and what he felt it was doing. It sounds like Art Babbitt did too.
yeah, yeah. Walt was a brilliant storyteller, and I don't think anyone would argue that. Even his detractors would say that he was a brilliant storyteller, and he knew what would move the public. So
Mm,
you're pointing out like something very, very pivotal that he like that if you look at other films of that time, if you look at 2 years later, Fleischer made the movie Gulliver's Travels. You know, it's the second animated feature film of all time, and they fall flat a little bit. You know, there's some entertaining parts in Gulliver's Travels, but the Fleischer brothers did not have the storytelling chops for a feature film
mm.
that Walt did. Um, Even though they had some of the same talent, like some folks migrated from Disney to Fleischer's to work on that movie, including the animator of Snow White. the character, Snow
Mm.
White. That was Grim Natwick. So some voice actors worked, some animators, Seamus Culhane, Pinto Colvig, some seriously talented people. And it still fell flat. So what was it? Well, the piece, the genius was Walt Disney and his storytelling abilities, and he just really knew how to connect with audiences. As his studio grew, and Snow White was indisputably a big reason of its growth. I think there were like 700 people who were working on Snow White, and close double that for Pinocchio, the
Mm.
following Disney film. Artists, just the artists, not to mention everyone else who works in the studio. Like there's maintenance and there's secretaries and there's like an auto shop on campus, and there's a soda shop where you can get, an ice cream soda delivered to your desk. And there's just like the artists were only about half of the staff, more or less maybe. And there were 1,400 working on Pinocchio and about 700 working on Snow White. So it kind of grew beyond Walt's own scope. Like it started out just as a small family venture, him and his brother. Um, so
Can you describe a little bit of that culture? Because it seems like Disney was, I don't know, maybe a little bit naive about what he was trying to do as the thing got bigger and bigger. But it seems like there's constantly a desire from Walt Disney to like keep a kind of family or communal thing going on. And that seems especially clear when they make the Burbank studio.
yeah, yeah, that's exactly it. So I dug up as many original documents from that time that I could. And I shaped my personal opinion based on what the folks of that time were saying. And there were so many people who were keeping records. There were like in studio stenographers who were keeping records of what people said during meetings within the Disney studio, what people said in meetings outside the Disney studio. So it was very easy for me to see what people at the time were saying. So during the making of Snow White, you had people saying, we don't know if it'll succeed, but if we go down, we'll go down together. We'll either all win and we'll all make money because Walt was promising profit sharing at that point, or we'll all go bankrupt, including Walt. So it was kind of like this ship of happy pirates, one all for one for all type of thing during the making of Snow White.
Right.
And then once that profit sharing didn't end up happening after Snow White, um, and the studio doubled in size, the opinions kind of changed according to those conversations that you can read. Many of them I put in the book word for word, just to bring some life and color out of it. That they're complaining that it has grown so big that even Walt is underestimating the importance of like the inkers and painters and how much work they put into it. And it's easy to get out of Walt's attention. And when Walt gives his famous speech to his entire staff, he also addresses the fact that he is so busy he can't give people individualized time like he used to. But he asks them to be patient and to, kind of just like deal with it. That's just like the nature of growing a business.
It seems like
So
so I've spent a lot of time as a college professor as an adjunct, right? And it seems I read it the way that they split up the animators as like this kind of hierarchy seems like it resonated with me in thinking about like tenured professors versus adjuncts because it
yeah,
seems like that was part of what people were pissed off about in as you approach the strike in 1941 is the fact that you had a lot of animators that were sort of like second class citizens essentially. They got paid a lot less. They did the same work as everybody else, but they got paid a lot less, and they weren't even given access to the perks, the same perks. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because that fascinated me, and I was thinking like, oh, well, this is a little bit like higher education, and the way there's a kind of like hierarchy there that breeds a resentment, but it seems like it's just the part of the way that the business is structured.
yeah. So like imagine you work in a place like a university or like any company, and you're not allowed to enter a certain break room until you earn a certain salary. It,
Yeah.
it was like that.
Yeah.
There was a private like gym on the top floor of the animation building. It was and people were lounging there. It was like you could get massages. There was a personal trainer, and you weren't allowed up there. It was called the Penthouse Club unless you earned a certain salary. Even if you were a Disney employee for years, if you weren't earning well, if you weren't earning at the time $100 a week in 1940, you weren't allowed to access this perk. If you uh, were a low-level animator, you didn't get the same kind of carpeting in your room as a higher level animator. And if you were the lowest level, you got no carpeting. There are like all these visual reminders of a kind of class system, even among the employees of the Disney studio. And that really rubbed Art Babbitt the wrong way. It rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Walt went up to Babbitt and asked, "Why aren't you joining the Penthouse Club?" And Babbitt said, "Well, I will as soon as you allow everyone to join."
Mm.
So that was Babbitt's demeanor in a nutshell. Like he was out for everyone's success. Whereas Walt was probably interested in incentivizing people, which is a tactic. You want to incentivize people to do
Yeah.
better work, but instead it just kind of like tore people apart.
How much one of the things that fascinated me about your book is sort of the role that left-wing politics, communists and socialists played in that history there, because it seems like even Walt Disney himself had a history of not only socialism in his family with his father,
Yeah.
but also, I don't know, even his dream of the Disney company, especially like building that campus, even though, yeah, it had, this class system in it, it seemed like he had a kind of communal family vision of like, we're all in this together, we're all sharing. I call it naive in part because I'm like, dude, you're just running like a corporation. Like, this is a corporation for profit. And if you talk to Roy Disney, who is the kind of like financial genius behind the whole Disney Corporation, his brother,
Yeah.
they were running a corporation. That's what it was. But Walt, how much was Walt like kind of a romantic idealist? And where's Art Babbitt in that as well? Because Babbitt's politics are kind of all over the place, but it seems like he had an innate sense of justice as well. I guess the larger context is that after all of this is said and done, Walt begins to think that all of it was communists, and that there were a lot of sort of like outside forces that intruded into his corporation and his vision.
Right. Right. Well, he was buying into that talk. That was the talk that like Gunther Lessing tuned him into,
Hmm.
the kind of literature that he was sharing with them. Because then, just like now, there were, right-wing pundits. Today we have 24-hour news networks. Back then, they had certain newspapers that are promulgating the the dangers of unions and how they're all either communist-led or mob-led. Now, it happens to be the fact that a lot of the mob was trying to get in on unions. Prohibition had just ended. They were looking for the next big score. And unions had fewer regulations, so that was like easy pickings for like the mob to come in. And one of Al Capone's henchmen, Willie Byoff, his actual name, Willie Byoff, came in and tried to sign up a lot of Disney employees, starting with the camera operators, and infiltrate them with a mob-led union. And that's what sort of started this whole thing.
Mm.
And Willie Byoff plays a very important role in the Disney strike, um, because then the company, Walt and Roy and Lessing, the vice president, have to decide: do we want to have an independent union come in and decide things for us, or do we want to have the mob come in and decide things for us? And unfortunately, they went for the latter, and that created I mean, I don't want to spoil any details, but it's just unbelievable what happened and how they chose the latter because of their intense panic around what was theoretically communist led.
It's so funny, and it's also interesting to me that the idea that for a long time before the strike happens, and ultimately like the struggle before the strike, and then as the strike unfolds, the Disney company is trying to like create their own like internal company union and being like this guild within our organization will be the one that allows you to sort of organize and agitate for the things you want here. You don't have to go to outsiders. It seemed like Walt was terrified of outside influence in his organization.
Yeah, it started out kind of like, why should we have an independent union decide things for us? And that intimidation, Gunther Lessing kind of exploited that and made that nervousness into a widening chasm until Walt was convinced that anything that wasn't within his studio was communist led.
Hmm.
Because it started out extremely benign. The idea of having an independent union was just basically so the studio artists could be on par with what was happening everywhere else in Hollywood. Screen Actors Guild, Screen Directors Guild, Screenwriters Guild, camera operators, background artists, secretaries, everyone in union in Hollywood was getting their own union. And the animators just wanted to be like everyone else. MGM, the folks who were making, Tom and Jerry, they already got the independent union to come in, and that bumped up everyone's wages.
Hmm.
So the Disney folks are like, we made Fantasia, we made Snow White and Pinocchio. Why are we being paid less than the people who make Tom and Jerry?
I agree.
Right. So they just wanted the same thing. It
Yeah.
wasn't like it didn't have to be so contentious. Um,
And all those unions showed up at the strike. Like all those other unions were there, like helping the Disney animators during all of this. I was fascinated because I was kind of thinking about the strike that just happened in Hollywood last year, and sort of like a similar sort of scene where you had, I don't know, there was a because they're showbiz people, there's a kind of theatricality to the picket lines and everything like that. And I thought that part of it is really, really interesting,
oh
honestly.
yeah, the writers had some wonderfully written signs. There's some really clever signs that showed up in like Instagram feeds. It was really great and totally reminded me of the Disney strike.
Do you think there were, I mean, were you writing this book at the same time as that strike was happening?
No, my book was complete at that time, but
Okay.
yeah, but some of the writers reached out to me to tell me that it was very inspirational to them, and I thanked them.
Yeah, I was wondering because I mean, God, I mean, I think it's easy to news happens so fast now the Hollywood strike seems like years ago, but it was just last year, and it was
Yeah.
sort of dominating headlines for a while. And I think that I don't know, that it seems similar in a lot of ways in terms of like the industry is changing. It's a different
Mhm.
historical moment, and people are looking to protect themselves one way or the other. And that seems like it resonates with your story too.
Yeah. And I think it's about trying to not be exploited by your employer. Uh, you know, we artists, we love what we do, but that should not equate to being paid less than what we're worth.
Can you describe a little bit of just the technical element of how animation is working at this moment? Because it does seem like as the Disney company expands its operations, it starts making feature-length films, it seems like they just need more and more people to do animation. And I don't know, that hierarchy of animation seems like there are artists there that get to like really contribute to the
Yeah.
shape of everything, and there are others who are just like they call them the in-betweeners, who are just kind of like filling in. How does all that work, and how does it translate to the labor part of it?
Well, animation has always been a multi-step process. Um, Even with CG, you have people who are leads and people who are assistants. But when you're talking about, classic hand-drawn animation, it worked very much like an assembly line where it really starts with, I mean, do you want me to go through the whole process? Is this something you
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, it's sort of meticulous in creating this stuff. I mean, yeah, you don't have to describe all the technical elements of animation, But I'm just wondering why it takes hundreds and hundreds of people to make this.
What phew,
Yeah,
I don't know how to answer that in a very in like a simple one sentence way.
yeah,
Because when you're making animation, you're creating every frame of film.
right.
And, you know? So I don't know. I guess imagine a feature film live action and multiply that by 24, maybe. I've never
Hmm.
ever given that as an answer, but like,
Is the structure of the of animation different now? In terms of its like I don't know its political economy because the what it seems like what I've heard a lot about is sort of like the offshoring of a lot of animation. I seem to remember, was it Beavis and Butthead, maybe South Park, that there was a controversy about sort of who does the animation and they kind of like doing it overseas and like almost like a sweatshop sort of kind of operation. It feels like animation could be a place where there's an easy exploitation of a lot of artists.
I don't know if those particular shows were even made overseas. I know that the first season of Beavis and Butthead was produced in New York City. Well, in
Hmm.
New York by the J.J. Settlemeyer studio.
Yeah.
South Park, I thought was all produced in the US.
Hmm.
Um, Actually using Maya, funnily enough, even though it's made to look like paper cutouts.
Maya
Um,
is a computer program, I'm assuming.
Maya is a computer program specifically made for computer generated animation for CG,
Okay.
So when you see a CG animated film that's not Pixar, it's usually made on Maya.
Mm.
Pixar has its own proprietary software. So like anything DreamWorks, or things like that, all used Maya to animate. And it's still the program of choice because it's very easy to use. So like universities that do animation in their curriculum use Maya to teach their students. So um, yeah, so South Park uses Maya.
I
That's
was
your
uh I was in school in college in the 90s. I went to UC Santa Barbara and I was in the film studies department and we had to take electives and one of the electives I took was an animation class and we had to make our own little animation using paper and like, tracing it and doing it like by hand.
all
And I'm
right.
wondering like how much is done that way anymore.
Well, okay, so paper was used for a long time. We're talking
Hmm.
from like the 19 teens up through drawing on paper up through the 1990s for animated film, for
Wow.
TV like the 2000s. And you're drawing everything on paper using a special animation desk with a little light that shines underneath and like testing your animation and maybe flipping it with your finger, kind of like a flip book to like see if it works and like testing it by shooting it frame by frame under a camera and then running that to see if it works. And then in the early 90s, 1990 or so, they started um uh, uh well they were inking and painting by hand until 1990 when
Mm.
when the CAPS system allowed people to just scan their paper drawings in and the computer would color them. And then now no paper is used at all. All the drawing is done directly with a stylus on a touch sensitive screen,
Mm.
and you can sort of like scrub through your drawings while you're watching it, like while you're drawing it. Instead of flipping papers by hand, you're just like scrolling left and right to see how your animation works. So now everything is done in front of a screen, even the hand-drawn stuff.
How does that change, I don't know, the work of an animator? It feels like it's a different game almost. I mean, there's a kind of, I don't know, a tactile. I mean, even just I guess I'm kind of asking your take on the aesthetic of animation even because there is a you talked about like the golden era of animation, right? With Snow White. And I mean, that was a long time ago, almost 100 years ago. But it seems like there is, I don't know, a nostalgia for that kind of animation. And whenever there is traditional cell animation, people kind of celebrate it as a throwback.
Mhm.
Um, but it seems like part of what your book gets at is the particular labor elements of doing that by hand, right? That's very different than maybe it's not so different. I don't know. I'm kind of wondering.
Well, like the labor at the time for the artist. So the director would hand an animator a little folder with their scene or scenes, like a script and maybe a storyboard drawing. The storyboard artist would also be working with the writers or directors to get the scene just right. Storyboard looking like a like a comic book frame by frame, main
Mm-hmm.
three beats. Sorry if I'm being pedantic. I'm just trying to cover my bases here.
No,
And
I love it.
so the lead animator would get like a storyboard drawing or two and the script and the duration of how many frames that moment should be, and they would draw in the key drawings, and then the assistant would clean up those key drawings so they weren't so rough, and then the in-betweener would draw the drawings in between those key drawings. And then after you have all of your paper drawings on graphite, a nice big stack, you would pass it along to the inkers who would take their paper drawing, put it under a sheet of celluloid and trace it with ink. And then that sheet would be passed to the painters who would flip it over and on the other side of the celluloid sheet, paint it with paint, with a paintbrush,
Mhm.
kind of like kind of like coloring in the lines, like a coloring book.
Right.
Now, the Disney inkers and painters, like author Mindy Johnson will point out that they didn't have erasers, for one thing, you know, and that the painting was often very sophisticated. For instance, they were creating colors. They had their own like chemistry lab in the ink and paint department at Disney. There was airbrushing. So when you wanted to get something like rosy cheeks or a gradual gradation of color in something, you would use an airbrush. If there was a semi-transparent thing like flower petals in Fantasia, or something like a veil, that there was special paint concocted for that. So painting was in itself an art form, and these inkers and painters were being paid um, hardly enough for many of them to subsist on. However, many inkers and painters, as many animators, felt that the strike was unnecessary. It was a minority, but only a slight minority, which is funny too, that only a very slight majority of artists wanted to go on strike. And the others were like, how can you be angry at Walt? He's giving us this incredible opportunity. We are creating art during the Great Depression, you know? Um,
Yeah, that's part of it. I think that I wanted to hear a little bit more about that because if one of the things that sort of surprised me reading your book, because you read about the Disney animators strike and you sort of get a surface understanding of it. And you think like, oh, all the animators were mad and they all left, but instead there was a deep and actually bitter split between the artists there, some that stayed and some that left. So,
yeah.
and I mean, you even write about how like wives were sometimes upset with their husbands for going on strike because it was the depression and being like, hey, we need a paycheck here, and you're sort of thumbing your nose at the corporation that pays us. So I'm wondering like it might not be one thing, but what are the kind of things that determined whether a person stayed or didn't stay or went on strike?
Oh, that's such a good question. Um, the majority of the lowest paid workers, like I think it really depended on, you know, what your principles were
Mm,
at the time. Art Babbitt was being paid as much as any, like he was among the highest paid animators there. There were no artists, I think, who were being paid more than him. His friend Bill Teitla went out on strike too, mostly out of allegiance towards Babbitt. A couple other top animators went on strike too, like Don Lusk, who was the lead animator for the Goldfish in Pinocchio, Cleo. And then you have um, on like basically like 315 artists in total, 315 Disney artists going out on strike. But there were also almost as many who didn't. Um, and, you know, I got to know a few of these folks before they passed on. They were all They were in their late 90s into their early 100s.
Wow, I was curious if you had met any of these people.
Yeah, yeah. Um, they're all gone now,
Hmm.
but Marge Champion, who was the model for Snow White and for the hippo and the tutu and for the Blue Fairy, she and I became friends, dare I say. I became very good friends with Willie Pyle, who was an animator starting in 1938 until the strike. He went out on strike. And I was able to talk to Don Lusk. Now, my interviews with them were more like for context. I did not want to put any interviews with modern memories as resources for the facts in the book, you
Right, that
know.
makes sense. Yeah.
But it was a tricky hurdle to have because if I'm only going for primary sources and not memories, where am I going to get my sources? So I had to do a lot of digging. But to answer your question, Willie Pyle, I asked him, why did he go on strike? He said, well, my friends were going on strike. So I went on strike too. I was like, okay, fair enough. I guess Walt succeeded in making a family, except the family had pockets of cohorts, and some of them went out against Walt. And even in 1941, by the way, a lot of them were talking about Walt's paternalism.
Mm, yeah, I mean, that comes out in the one of the speeches that he gives,
Yeah.
where, I mean, maybe you can describe that moment because it seems like at some point, Walt, before he shuts up and decides, and is told not to address the strikers, he does kind of a Hail Mary where he gets everybody together at the company and gives this speech, and it's sort of extraordinary what he has to say.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it sort of goes down. Some people say that it was heartfelt, and some people say that it was infamous because it kind of like poo-pooed the strikers and kind of like the strike hadn't happened yet, but there was a lot of union talk at that point. So he was kind of poo-pooing the union that was trying to come in. And and Walt was under a lot of duress at that time. The war in Europe had started. The US had not joined the war, but it was cutting off,
Mhm.
foreign income because no one in Europe is going to go, dodge the bombs to go to the movies. So that was a big revenue stream that was, curtailed. And so Walt thought that he might have to, like, he already like laid off a bunch of people just to keep the studio going. Um, and then he started laying off people who were members of the union, and the members of the union didn't like that at all. He started talking about how he's trying to keep things going and he doesn't want disruptors. And there are those who were at the meeting who said that Walt did more damage than good with that talk and trying to address everyone.
Yeah, I think if I remember part of it, he was like basically saying like, look, if you want to be in the penthouse club and use the gym, then you should, work a little harder and work your way up the ladder, and that's just the way it is, And it's sort of like it, as much as you're right, an incentive program can have its own logic. It seemed like it was just like the wrong tone to take at that particular moment. It's just like, hey, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, guys, and you're like, well, I don't know. It also feels like a particular moment in the history of the company in terms of their, I don't know, their overall direction. I don't, Snow White was such a success, and it seems like Pinocchio and Fantasia were not, right?
The war had already started, so each of those films lost about $1 million.
Wow.
Yeah, upon their initial release. Yeah, it was it was it one tends to wonder what would have happened if the war hadn't started and Walt was given just like more free reign to just continue making these movies.
Mm,
Like at that time, what I like to point out to people is that there was no single like Disney storytelling style. There was a Disney visual style, but he had not settled on a particular kind of franchise of feature films. They were merchandising the mouse and Mickey's friends, but there was no such thing as a Disney princess movie. There Snow White was a fairy tale. I guess fairy tales was it, but not really. Pinocchio was a fairy tale, but it's a boy story.
Hmm.
Fantasia is an acid trip that has no story.
It's kind of that's what's kind of surprising to me. Like reading that particular sort of run of early Disney movies is sort of like 'cause I mean I grew up with Disney as a very like you mentioned like a princesses like a certain brand,
Yeah.
but it seems like at the time Walt was very experimental and it seems like he even had a desire to make or intersect with the world of high art.
Oh,
With
so
I mean
much.
Fantasia seems like that.
Dumbo and Bambi, Dumbo is just like succinct storytelling where the main character, the title character, doesn't even talk.
That's right.
And there are some crazy scenes in Dumbo. Um, And Bambi, I mean, they were like dissecting deer and studying like how animals actually move. You look at the deer in Snow White against the deer in Bambi, and it's just night and day. Like they really got down to the hard anatomy of how deer move. And how do you make once you know how a deer moves and you can draw its musculature from memory, how do you make it act?
Mm.
And figured that out too. So only people forget also Bambi, only half of Bambi is cutesy kitty animals. The other half of the movie is like pretty dynamic adult deer who are trying to survive fire and hunters' dogs and and Bambi's trying to fight his like a deer who's trying to dominate him for power. Um,
It's a traumatic movie.
Many, yeah, for generations. Um, and also Tyrus Wong was the art designer for that, and he's like a Chinese artist, so there's a lot of Chinese art influence in that film. Like you
That
look
makes
at,
sense, yeah.
yeah, just some of the beautiful color schemes used in that movie. So Walt was entirely experimental, and there is no single Disney storytelling style throughout the Golden Age, and then the war disrupts that. After Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, Bambi. Walt's Walt's just trying to survive financially. And so he comes out with during the war, he figures out ways to get money from the government to make propaganda films and training films. And then he makes package films, which are like shorter things put together. And his first feature film, after he gets on his financial feet again, is just as he said, let's just make another Snow White because it did so well. So they made Cinderella. And they were right. It made money.
Mm.
And then later that same decade, Sleeping Beauty, you know. Um,
How did the that era right after the strike and through the war? Because you mentioned that the propaganda part of it, but I had no idea that at some point during the war, like 95% of the stuff that Disney is putting out is like either a training film or some kind of industrial film for the war effort or even more overt like propaganda stuff. I'm wondering how the animators felt about making that. I don't know if that was within your research, but it seems like I don't know, that might cause a certain kind of I know that it was kind of a lull in the history of the company one way or the other.
well, there's some great books that are written about that, and a great documentary called "Doing Their Bit" that A&E put out a couple decades ago. Um, there's been a lot that's written about Disney and animation in general during the war era, and it's fascinating. From what I understand, every artist, whether they like their boss or not, knows that this is an important fight to fight, and they
Yeah.
want to do whatever they can. And many of them would prefer to fight their fight with a pencil than with a gun. And
For
so,
sure.
and
Yeah.
so many did. What's interesting though is that yes, while the military did commandeer the Disney studios and they were making like propaganda films and even the South American films, which the government bankrolled them to do. There were other government-run animation studios that employed artists from all over. So now you have like Fort Roach was the nickname of one of these studios in California that had strikers. like Willie Pyle, working next to non-strikers like Frank Thomas and Warner Brothers artists like Norm McCabe, all working together to make uh, some military films, like educational films for soldiers on camouflage or on what to do uh, around a booby trap or how to keep your, lips sealed when traveling, when like landing abroad.
Hmm.
Um, and it becomes really fascinating to see how like that was like the great equalizer for the animators. Even though it was a terrible thing on all other counts, it seemed to bring the animators together.
Yeah, it seems like, and it's funny because it's an important part of the history of not only the war but the war in LA, right? Like California and Los Angeles become a different place over the course of World War II.
Mhm.
I mean, I've told this story in the podcast many times, but like, my grandparents met through like my grandma being essentially a Rosie the Riveter at a Douglas aircraft plant in Santa Monica, and my grandfather being a GI who went to some of these sort of like military sponsored dances in LA, and that's where they met. And the sort of like history of the war brought them together. But it seems like the history that you're telling here with the Disney strike and the kind of the way that the war shaped the Disney Corporation is as much a part of that story. These are like industrial. This is like the industrial production of the war, and animation seems like a key part of it. I don't know if animation was as much a part of World War One as it was
Oh,
World War Two.
I don't think, yeah. A little, well, there's, I think, like a Felix the Cat cartoon where he's in World War One. But
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. Now we're getting a little bit off topic, but I find this also fascinating. Um, that although this isn't in my book, The Disney Revolt, not so much where I touch upon World War II, but I don't really have the pages to go into it. My editor had to cut it down quite a bit. Um, but during World War II, animation became such a very useful tool because, like, of a couple of reasons. One, you can do things in animation that you can't do on film, and and have the audience laugh at it. And second, like, no one wanted to see a live actor who wasn't a soldier on screen. The soldiers couldn't act, and the actors hadn't fought. So no one seemed to be a great, you know, person to portray someone in the military. The only exception was cartoon characters.
Yeah.
They could. So you have, every cartoon character oversee Daffy Duck fighting Nazis, uh, Donald Duck fighting Nazis, Pluto fighting Nazis who look like Chip and Dale. They're saboteurs, Chip and Dale.
Wow.
The first cartoon was a World War II cartoon called I forget what it's called, but they're in a pillbox. And I think it's called Squatters' Rights, if I'm not mistaken. And Pluto has to protect the pillbox, the pillbox being like a dome-shaped place where a machine gunner would be inside of, and apparently it had been infiltrated by Chippendale, and they're busting nuts with the machine gun that's protruding from the pill. Um, so yeah, that's animation was there to get people's minds off of the war and to get people to laugh at something that would otherwise make them cry.
Yeah.
And nothing else could do it. Animation was the only thing that could do it.
Well, I want to thank you for talking with me about your book. I want to say the name of it again before we go. It's called The Disney Revolt, The Great Labor War of Animation's Golden Age. And as long as we're a little off topic, I wanted to ask you before we go, sort of, you know, what is animation to you? Like, why are you so into it? Because one of the things that Neil Gabler in his book, his biography of Walt Disney describes, he gets kind of like psychological, and he talks about Disney as sort of like loving animation because it gave him a space to create fantasy and to create almost have like a godlike power of bringing things to life. What was it for you? Because I know you and I probably grew up in a very different era than Walt Disney, surrounded by animation as like, I don't know, a central a central piece of art in pop culture. How did you? What? Give me some psychological insight here, Jake. What makes you such an animation
Oh,
person?
I don't know. No, I, I, I don't know. Even now, as an adult, I love animation and I love watching animation. Um, there's, I think it's the greatest artistic medium that the world has ever seen.
Mm,
I think it's limitless, and there are very few things in this world that you can say are limitless. The most remarkable things have been done with animation. There's an author named Scott McCloud who wrote a great book called Understanding Comics. And in his conversation about comics, he says something which can be equally applied to animation. He says that the more realistic the person's image is, like a photo or a frame of live action film, the more we watch or see it as them there, and the more we're removed from that image. That's a them. They are them, and I
mm.
am me. But the more abstract the image is, like a circle, two dots for eyes, and a line for a mouth, the more we say, "Oh, that's me." The more we identify with that image. So I may watch a live action film and say, "That's a very entertaining actor," but I won't identify with the actor. But if I watch an animated film with an abstractified face that could be a very generic face, could look like dozens of people, I might say, "Oh, that's me. I am in that adventure." And I think animation sucks me into the story more than anything else for that reason.
That is really, really interesting. And if I could make a stretch to like the Disney strike, the animator strike of 1941, it seems like many of the artists felt that one way or the other, a certain kind of empathy, a certain kind of what comes out of your book from so many of the artists, whether they went on strike or not, is how deeply invested they were in their work, how much it wasn't just a job. And I mean, even for Disney himself, I think that's part of like the key to why he was so shocked and ultimately broken in some way by the strike was realizing that there was a business element to this. Because it seems like it's one of the reasons why he had Roy Disney, his brother, handle all the money because he was so deeply invested in the story element, the art element, going back to, having Grumpy cry, it's such a key part of it. And that's kind of mind blowing. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, thank you for being so interested in Disney history and my book, The Disney Revolt, available where books are sold.
Go find it, everybody. Thank you, Jake S. Friedman.
Thank you, David Parsons.
Well, all right, my friends. I think that's going to wrap it up for episode 400 of Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank Jake S. Friedman for coming on the show and sharing his thoughts and ideas and this insane history of the animator strike. His book is The Disney Revolt, The Great Labor War of Animation's Golden Age. I thoroughly recommend it if you're looking to get a slice of American labor history that honestly more people ought to know because it connects so directly to the history of art and popular culture. And I was thinking just a lot about Hollywood and the crazy moment that it's in right now as we see AI and streaming completely revolutionizing the industry and that causing labor problems too. So this was a really, really great conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much, everyone who is subscribed to the Patreon. If you haven't done that, there is a link in the episode description. I really appreciate your support. And I thank everyone for listening to and hopefully enjoying these episodes. We'll talk to you again very soon.